welcome to the Beam Exchange, which is, as you probably know, a platform for knowledge sharing and in learning about market systems development. And one of the things we do is create these spaces which we provide to encourage open information exchange about market systems development in practice. They are open to any organization that has knowledge or ideas to share. So please contact us if you would like to put yourself in the hot seat. So let's begin. Market systems development, the approach, is essentially concerned with the way that poor women and men, businesses and governments and other agencies engage and interact with each other in the economy. And we call these interactive multi-actor, multi-function spaces market systems. You're probably familiar with the diagram. Our basic rationale, our hypothesis, is that the key to achieving improvement, better income, jobs, and access to essential services for people living in poverty is to transform how these market systems function in ways that are both widespread and enduring, lasting, scale and sustainability. And today's webinar is about whether our hypothesis is correct. In other words, how well does the market systems development approach work? Does it help transform market systems in practice? And is that reducing levels of poverty? So in a moment, I will introduce you to the two consultants, Kevin Conroy and Adam Kessler, who wrote our most recent review of the evidence. But before that, let me just take a moment to put their review into some context. So when we started the Beam Exchange in about 5 years ago, 2014, one of our three main goals was related to credibility. And we wanted to build an evidence base that could be used by researchers or practitioners to assess the impact and the effectiveness of the market systems development approach in general. Now, the first step in building that evidence base was to gather the documents that provide the evidence. And we did this with a systematic search procedure, and we continue to do this with a systematic search procedure, but also through more informal gathering of data, of documents through our networks with people like yourselves. Now, for a resource to be classified as evidence and included in the evidence map, it must fulfill a number of criteria, and these are listed here. It has to be relevant, in other words, it has to be related to what we're talking about. It has to be accessible publicly or through the Beam website. It needs to be transparent, and in other words, clear about the methodologies, both for use for data collection, but also as used for the analysis of results. And it needs to be credible. So those methods need to be credible in terms of how they generate data, but also credible in terms of how they've been analyzed. And finally, the document needs to be cogent. It needs to present a convincing argument. Now, whether or not a document meets these criteria is determined by an independently appointed consultant. And in practice, because that's complicated, we do this kind of quality assurance process roughly once a year. And the first year that we did it, we identified and included 70 documents. It was in 2016. The following year, in 2017, 97. And now, at the end of 2018, when this review point took place, we have 151 documents in the evidence base. Now, the second step is to present the evidence in a publicly accessible way. And remember that the point of producing this evidence base is to inform category, which is a type of intervention that the document describes. And these documents can be tagged with one or more of these intervention types. Now, I know this is quite simplistic, but what it enables us to do is to provide a kind of visual map. So if you're familiar with the evidence map, you'll recognize this matrix. And this enables people to identify where there is evidence at different levels and also for different types of intervention area. Now, in addition to that, you can also, if you're a user of this map, you can also filter it according to various other criteria, such as the type of evidence, the location, the country that the evidence is describing, also the different sectors that the programs are working in. And that gives you this kind of, when you use one of these filters, you get a more refined evidence map, and you can see the numbers change there. So you're seeing a smaller subsection of what's in the data. And then finally, when you're ready to dive into a particular set of data, you can click on one of these circle in numbers, and you get an oversight like that of exactly what documents are available in that particular category of that particular section of the evidence map. Now, that's the process we use for building the evidence map. And then, as I said, each year, as soon as we've completed our sort of gathering of new data, as soon as possible, we contract an independent consultant or consultants to review the material. And this year, the target audience for the review, by the way, is people like yourselves, practitioners, but also particularly senior decision makers and policy advisors within donor agencies. And this year, the terms of reference that we gave the consultants asked them to focus in particular on new content. So we had about 16 new documents. And to answer these questions here, what does it tell us about the outcomes of programs or interventions? Are they achieving systems change? What does the evidence base tell us about the impact of those changes in terms of poverty reduction? And what does the evidence base tell us about the cost effectiveness or the value for money of these interventions, and indeed of the approach as a whole? And finally, we asked the consultants to give us more broad conclusions and recommendations based on their analysis. And that, I'm very pleased to say, is what they've done. And so I would like to introduce Adam Kessler, who I think is going to speak third. And the first speaker I'm going to introduce is Kevin Conroy, who did the bulk of the work. Now, before I hand over to him, please take a note of the fact that we have a chat box down in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen there. You've probably seen it, and that is the place to post your questions. We have actually had a few very interesting questions in advance of the webinar from the registration process. So we will be starting the Q&A after the speakers finish. But if you have now or during the course of the webinar things you would like to comment on or questions you would like to ask the speakers, please put them into that chat box, and I will do my best to monitor that as they talk and give you responses and put those questions to the speakers after they've finished their formal presentations. Thanks for that. So Kevin, would you like to take us away?
So I'm not going to put my video on just to save bandwidth. My name is Kevin Conroy. I'm a private sector development consultant, and I also have a few startup businesses across West Africa. Thanks to everyone for joining today. It's good to see some familiar faces in the participant list. And I'm also coming to you live from Liberia. So I'm going to go through what we did and then dive into some examples and case studies that we looked at to give us a real feel for how market system development is being applied and what results are coming out. Okay, so we all know there are growing calls for evidence of results. Anyone who's a practitioner program probably feels this pressure to come through and show what they're delivering as a program. But we also know that market system development is now an established approach to understanding and intervening in markets so that they better perform for men and women. However, a crucial question in this review was, how well does the MSD approach work in practice? So as Mike was saying, we have over 150 resources now in the evidence map, thanks to Beam's collation. And we use this and their aggregate categorization to basically identify common themes such as systemic change, types of results that were coming through, look at the sectors they're looking at and the resource types used. And we also did a deeper dive into the 58 new pieces of evidence that were gathered in 2018. This allowed us to examine if they apply the principles of market systems development. Did they report on value for money? How is the quality of the data? And it also allowed us to contextualize and help us understand what programs mean by impact and how it was delivered. So what did we find? So the evidence map, as you can see from the table here, the evidence map now contains a fair spread of evidence documents reporting results at all levels. We're seeing it come through from the intervention level right through to poverty reduction. We also can note that at least 1/3 of the evidence resources are now discussing systemic change, which I believe is what we're all in the business of trying to achieve as practitioners. Also, over 40 reports reported against poverty reduction, which is often our long-term goal established by our log frames or put forward by our funders. And finally, it was worth noting of the 58 resources that were entered into in 2018, almost all of them reported positively against these types of results. Great. We also did put on here a slide to look at the sectors. Now, as we can see, a vast majority of evidence and resources in the evidence base from MSD programs are covering agriculture. I know, and perhaps most of our practitioners who are out there know intuitively that agri reform often offers a great opportunity to address market failures and also reach a large number of the poor. However, it is good to see that there's more divergence, more variety of the type of sectors that MSD is being applied to, from manufacturing through to education. And we expect to see further diversification as market systems gets rolled into more programs. Beyond looking at the aggregate results, we also looked at some case studies in more detail. We felt that the case studies here offered us information on what they achieved in growth and access and also on the impact on the poor. Secondly, they also reported on how the results were achieved, what worked. And thirdly, they often identified the market systems principles they used to design their interventions and to get to their results. What we see in these programs is quite a variety of contexts that market systems has been applied. So we have Malawi oil sector transformation. We have ELAN in the DRC, we have Prisma in Indonesia, Enable 2 in Nigeria, and MDF in Pakistan. What we see is that market systems being applied in South Asia, Asia, and Africa, quite a geographic spread. We're seeing different economies such as Indonesia, Nigeria versus Malawi. And we're seeing sectors here from agricultural reform through to infrastructure and also business environment. So we're also seeing that our examples within the evidence base are bringing out quite a varied context of how it's being applied. And this helps us understand, maybe as a practitioner or when you're looking to design a program, that there are reference points to similar types of sectors, similar geographies or nations that market systems is being applied. Okay, I'm going to take you through some of these case studies here to give us an idea of the context and what we mean by impact and what we mean by results. First off, we're going to look at MDF, the Market Development Facility. What is worth noting here is that many of these case studies that we're going into, these are just one intervention out of a much wider pool of program activities. For example, MDF here works in over 5 countries, and in Pakistan alone is working from the cucumber sector to dates. So today we're going to look at their cattle silage intervention because we found it quite interesting. What we found in this intervention, which we liked, was how silage producers crowded into the marketplace, and then that was followed by equipment suppliers underwriting finance. So what was the problem here? Well, in brief, they identified that in the dairy sector, there was low milk yields during the dry season. And the question was, why was that? So after some investigation and looking at the root cause, the team of MDF came up with the lack of cattle feed during the periods of drought. The lack of feed meant that the cattle could not produce the high yields that would be expected. So MDF was looking for a sustainable, innovative solution. And what they did was work on a technical solution to develop a low-cost silage model that could actually lead to cattle feed all year round. This was quite different from perhaps directly supplying feed or the government stepping in to subsidize farmers when there was low yields or putting some price thresholds on. What they did instead was take this technical model and provide it to interested entrepreneurs who wanted to get involved in this sector of the market. They also provided entrepreneurs with business development support. And then this enabled an original very small number of suppliers to actually grow into a cohort of silage producers who were supplying farmers with silage all year round. For me, and the programs that I've seen, establishing a commercial relationship that is profitable for both sides is really important when you're looking to sustainability and applying the market systems approach. However, the second task that MDF faced was how do you scale the provision of silage, and to do this in a way that was sustainable and not distorting the market, perhaps such as giving grants or giving out equipment. So MDF acted as a facilitator. They negotiated between potential equipment suppliers and with local banks to provide finance to the growing market. Essentially, the equipment suppliers underwrote the loan that would be given to these new silage entrepreneurs in order to reduce interest rates and increase the opportunities for finance for businesses. So what did this mean in the end? Well, from a very nascent, almost no actors in the silage business in this part of Pakistan, MDF's seen the number of entrepreneurs grow from almost none to 16, and then eventually to over 100. So we're seeing that crowding into the business opportunity that people see. These silage businesses were able to reach over 11,000 smallholder farmers, providing them with year-round feed. These farmers then could turn that into increased milk yields. And then it was estimated by 2018 that this was in total of 50 million of increased incomes for these smallholder farmers. The program itself estimates that this will increase to over 33,000 farmers in 2019 and grow onwards from that. If anyone in the audience was part of these interventions and would like to elaborate more, they can perhaps do so during the discussions. I can see John Clifford there, who is part of Enable 2, so maybe he'll want to contribute later. For the sake of time, I have Prisma here, but I'll skip forward to most. What we really liked about this intervention and what we found interesting is how it responded to a lack of access to inoculant, which was brought on by subsidies and government control. The interventions themselves required both a policy change on the business side and then that technical assistance to agri-input businesses. So we have both a policy side and a technical support. The problem that was understood by the team that was low yields from soybeans and other oilseeds. The root cause that they identified in this case was the Ministry of Agric had a monopoly of production and of marketing, and they were selling this inoculant at a loss. The most team estimated that the Ministry of Agric's department was producing around 15,000 sachets, but there was a demand out there for over 400,000. So there was a big gap in the need there. There wasn't a commercial incentive for increasing supply, and the regulation stopped private production. Just to note that as a practitioner as well, I've seen many well-intentioned subsidy plans that actually result in less access to fertilizers and agro inputs for farmers than was intended. So most had a two-step solution. First of all was opening a dialogue for policy change in 2014. They had a series of dialogues with the private sector, agro-input dealers, and the Ministry of Agriculture, other donors, and other people pressing for change, including farmers. This dialogue led to one of their first achievements, which was an agreement to allow private production of inoculant. After that significant step, most moved into supporting agro-input businesses to pilot a commercial production and distribution of inoculant. So again, what does this mean in practice? What did this turn out to be in results? Well, the business that they supported in its second year was able to produce 78,000 sachets of inoculant against an original 15,000 that was being produced by the Ministry of Agriculture. They worked with over 60 distributors and were able to sell over 50,000 sachets to farmers. This allowed, in terms of results, 17,500 farmers benefiting from access, and this access allowed increased higher yields. The program estimated that the income from these higher yields was about $80 per farmer, or 1.4 million in total. There is a forecast that the access will grow to about 65,000 farmers in the coming years, and this would equate to about 5 million in increased incomes. So through these examples that I've just spoke to, we can see that the evidence map does provide a resource which can be very beneficial to people like yourselves who might want to go in and look at how market systems has been successful in the same sector or similar sector, perhaps in the same country, or perhaps looking at policy reform as well. So I think on that note, I would now hand over to Adam, who can talk about some of the other things we've seen about the evidence coming through.
Okay, hi everyone, I hope you can hear me okay. I've turned on my camera so you can also feast your eyes on my sitting room. And I'm just going to go to the next slide. And so we're going to talk about the evidence kind of base that underlies this. And so I think the kind of important achievements which Kevin has outlined and Mike spoke about come with some caveats related to the strength of the evidence base behind them. And I think there are a number of ways in which the evidence base was open to challenge. So I think firstly, there was a heavy reliance on internal reviews within the kind of evidence framework. Most of them were commissioned by the teams implementing programs, and just 2 of the documents we reviewed were externally conducted. Just to put kind of my biases up front, I do work as an internal MRM advisor, and so I definitely appreciate and understand the importance of internal reviews, both learning and for credible reporting to FUNA. And a number of the projects did use the DCED standards. They had relatively high quality of theories of change, of logic, measurement, and so on. But I think when you're sitting back and looking at an evidence base more broadly, if all of this evidence comes from an internal source, then the independence is open to question. And more fundamentally, the purpose of this research was to showcase an intervention. It was not to look at how did the MSD approach help this intervention happen. And I think that kind of moves into the second point, the reliance on project-focused case studies. So methodologically, I think almost all of the documents we reviewed were case studies. There were just 2, one impact assessment added in the year we were looking at. And they were looking at a single project and how a single intervention did. This also links to the next point that there's a certain publication bias. I think Zanibi asked about this earlier, that positive, almost all the research which was produced was positive, and that it talked about how well something went. There wasn't much on failure. And they looked at the higher levels of the results chain. So it looked at the outcomes of the program, but not many things interrogated in depth. How did these changes happen? And was it the market systems approach which was fundamental in enabling these changes, or was it just, would any mode of delivery have been just as good? Okay, back to you, Kevin.
I hope everyone can hear me again. So I'm just going to come back in and talk briefly about value for money. It's something that I find very interesting, particularly as the programs that I work on are continually asked more to discuss, debate, and report on value for money. So what we've seen in the evidence base is that although there was over 50 new resources added in 2018, only 8 discussed value for money, and only 4 of those 8 were clearly delivering value for money in terms of how it was judged by the funder. There were some challenges that go beyond that. So we know that ex post data, that is research that's done after a program is finished or into the future projections of the program results, is absent. But yet that's where we often see our biggest return on the investments we made as a program. For example, the program I'm on at the moment has been running for about 5-6 years, and only in the last 2 years have results started to come through that match our log frame, in some places exceed it, but we expect the next phase of the program to really solidify the returns and continue growth to be seen. But there's often, very often, no type of data collected to that extent. Secondly, and this is something I've experienced in a number of programs, is calculating value for money requires a change on how programs collate their spend data, and also how that is attributed to the activities. It's a very tedious and also arbitrary task that needs to be done, where you tag all of your spending against an activity for the program, and that activity is part of perhaps a work plan or an intervention plan. That is required to actually get a true reflection of your spend on intervention activity. And a lot of programs who are not currently doing it now are unable to go back and do it on their previous spend. This is also perhaps distorting some of the value for money figures that have come out. And even when you go in and you do this hard work to do the research after the program's finished, and also to collate and manage all of your spend data and attribute it to an intervention, there's still some real conceptual challenges by what we mean and the value of limited learning we get from discussing value for money. Just to give you a very quick example, if we were to look at a very common one, the cost per beneficiaries, how many dollars did it cost to get an increase in income, or what value of income was increased for each dollar spent by a program? That's fine when you're doing some internal review and looking at how you could improve. But when you try to compare that learning across different sectors, different countries, compare programs across different types of economies, those comparisons are actually probably flawed and don't give you a very good feel for who's performing better or for what it's actually telling you about the program. For example, looking at the cocoa sector in Liberia, the cost per dollar of income for a farmer versus, say, the rice sector in Nigeria, those comparisons aren't very valid in my opinion. So there's still a lot of learning as a community to do about what we mean when we discuss value for money and how we can actually discuss it and learn together.
So I'm going to keep my video turned off, so you will not have such a good view. But on the plus side, hopefully you can hear me better. And we're going to get into the question of what kind of evidence is required. And this is something a lot of people put questions in before the webinar, and we don't have the finalized answer. So I'm just going to give some initial thoughts, and then hopefully you can add more in our questions and answers at the end. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that the question of whether MSD works or not is a challenging one, and much more challenging than it first appears. And there are a couple of issues. Firstly, that MSD covers a whole range of programs, and they're linked together by a commitment to a set of shared development principles and practices, but different sectors, different geographies, different ways of working. For example, I see Anastasia asked about MCC, I think Millennium Challenge Corporation, cost-benefit analysis. That was kind of outside the scope because they're not part of the Beam community as far as I'm aware. And so saying what is the MSD approach is quite difficult, and so asking for evidence of it is difficult. Moreover, even once you have defined it, all of the things which make it a valuable methodology, adaptive, complex, and so on, also impose technical problems to evaluation. The fact that beneficiaries choose to be part of an intervention makes it difficult to, for example, use an RCT, as Kevin has very well asked. Similarly, the fact that you work through market actors, you're working, let's say, through a seed company or through a contract farmer, it makes it hard to exert the level of control needed for an experimental RCT design. Similarly, the adaptive nature of interventions, if you run a big baseline, but then your whole approach changes, that baseline is worthless. So you can waste a lot of money quite quickly. And the focus on the direct beneficiaries of a project, which is what you would normally get in an RCT or in many of the studies we looked at, it doesn't tell you much about the broader system, which is where we think the big impact is. So I think you need to acknowledge the challenges of the evidence base and not have unrealistic expectations of what we can get out of it. And on this slide, there are a couple of familiar recommendations, I think. We know that evaluations need to be longitudinal, coping with the complexity of an MSD approach by having an evaluator working alongside the project, not just coming in at one point in time. Independent, so having someone who is external enough to the program to kind of give a different voice. And then theory-based, looking at the logic of the program, what it's doing. And it's worth saying, I don't think we saw evaluations like this in our review, but we only reviewed 1 year worth of data of evaluations, and I know more designed in this way are coming through. And Matthias asks an excellent question we'll kind of come back to. So I think the question comes back to, what does a solid evidence base look like? Like, what kind of are we looking for? And I think it's worth noting that if you look at the evidence base that the Beam Exchange has, it's a load of project reviews, evaluations, I think all project focused and commissioned by either projects who want to talk about their success or donors who want accountability. So they're not setting up to ask this question of, is MSD better than direct delivery programs? Does the facilitation analysis, does it actually add value? It's kind of not what they're for. So a few ways to try and improve the evidence base would be to firstly clearly define the evidence of MSD under evaluation. Are you looking at adaptive programs, at facilitation, at considerations of a broader system, participation? I think there's a lot wrapped up in the concept you can usefully unpack. And secondly, moving from project-based research to either comparative studies of different MSD programs, looking at what works best in different contexts, and using the opportunity to compare to understand better how an MSD approach helps, and also comparing to non-MSD programs. So this comparison of direct delivery to MSD is one which we make quite glibly. You've probably seen a diagram of like impact going up over time for MSD and reducing over time for direct delivery. But I'm not aware of what the underlying evidence for it. It's just something we use in training programs. And I think the other interesting angle might be market system-based research. So rather than starting with a project, start with a market system like seeds in Bangladesh, and then see how that market system has changed over time, and if you can trace the impact of various interventions. And finally, ex post evaluations coming back after the end of the project. I know there are a few up and running now, but for a kind of discipline which prides itself on sustainability, I think this is a critical point to emphasize if we want to build a future evidence base. So that's it for me. Mike, can I hand over to you?
Very, very nice to hear you. And I've also put my camera off if the problems we had with my microphone or organization resolved. So I hope you can all hear me now. You just mentioned, Adam, at the end there that a couple of sort of longitudinal evaluations and ex post evaluations that have been coming through, and will be included in the evidence base next year, but didn't make the filter this year. I wanted to take the opportunity to let Ed Headley from ICAD say a few words about a couple of these studies that have just been completed. Ed, can you hear us? Can you speak?
You need to unmute yourself, Ed, by clicking the little mic on your on the kind of video cutout.
Sorry about this. We did warn Ed that we were going to ask him to speak. We didn't tell him how to make himself heard.
methodological. Can you hear me? Don't think you can.
Yes, we can still hear you.
Okay.
Carry on.
And I think what I got from that is there's no methodological magic bullet for looking at complexity. And a lot of the more sophisticated methods, I think, have been tried but have underperformed expectations. And this leaves the kind of simple common sense approach of trying to understand how a program expected to influence the system, and moving from that to trying to gather data from different actors on actually what happened. I think the major limitation that I've seen in these evaluations is nothing too complicated. It's just that they didn't talk to enough people outside the immediate program scope. So there weren't enough interviews with, let's say, seed suppliers who they didn't work with, or farmers who weren't in the immediate village. So I think that's the main limitation I saw. Kevin, do you want to add?
Thank you.
Or Mike?
Kevin?
I would second Adam's point. Certainly going through the documents in 2018 that were added, which was quite a substantial number, there wasn't a great variety of, wasn't diversity or variety in the methodologies being used, and that comes through. But I would say from my experience, it's a struggle when you have quite scientific impact assessments versus perhaps a case study which goes into detail and tells a story of a community, an individual, or a sector. And it's difficult to bridge. And I'm very interested in what Adam's raised about outcome harvesting and looking more at that and how that could help our program deliver those kind of powerful messages. It's certainly a challenge. I think is a standard that we hold ourselves to. And I think it's something that we need to overcome as a community, is how do we get that bridge between a case study, which is great, explaining a particular intervention or systemic change, versus linking that to those impact evaluations.
Okay, thank you. Well, look, Ed Headley, I think, has now got his mic working. So I'm going to see if he can just give us a few words about these two evaluations that have come online recently. Ed?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Ed, we can hear you.
Oh, finally, crikey. I thought that was going to work again. So sorry about that. So just quickly, I can say a few words about two longitudinal evaluations that ITED have just completed. So one is of the Samarth program in Nepal, and the other is of the Food Trade Eastern Southern Africa program. So they were both DFID funded market systems programs. So we've been running the Samarth evaluation since early 2017 and completed it this summer. And we've been running the food trade evaluation since, I think, 2014. It's been going for quite a while now. And we finished that earlier this year. So I just wanted to highlight that our report for the food trade evaluation is on the Beam website, and the final report for Samarth will be on the website very soon. And just to recap, so food trade aimed to catalyze more efficient trade in staple food in the region, and to benefit farmers, suppliers, service providers, etc. And Samarth was quite a sort of a classic FLP program in Nepal, which aimed to improve how the market functioned in a series of sectors in Nepal. And I also wanted to take the moment, so thank you very much, Mike, for giving us the opportunity to highlight that we've got a couple of learning briefs, we're calling them, which highlight some of the key lessons that we've learned from both evaluations. So for instance, for food trade, we highlight the importance of transparency between market players and trust in sort of predicting successful interventions, and the importance of time required to experiment and adapt. And on Samarth, so we were asked by DFID to focus primarily on the question of whether we thought market systems programs could work in the Nepal context. And so we provided a short answer to that, which is we think in principle it can. The answer is yes. but there are a number of conditions needed to make market systems programs effective in Nepal, and there's a few caveats attached to that. So, for instance, we highlight the importance of tackling demand and supply constraints simultaneously, and the importance of a demand pull behind successful interventions, and in facilitating strategic partnerships between market players, and in working hand in hand with the public sector to tackle enabling environment constraints, and hopefully doing all three of those things simultaneously, if possible. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight the fact that we've got these two reports, which hopefully will be of interest, and they will soon both be on the Beam website.
Well, thanks very much, Ed, and congratulations, well done for sort of persisting in getting your technology sorted out.
It's a horrible moment where I couldn't find the icon.
Yeah, apologies for leaving you leaving you in the lurch like that. So if you can stay online, but maybe mute your mic just for now. Yeah, we'll look at some of these other questions. I've got a lot of questions coming in, so I'm sort of trying to decide how to manage this. But there's one question which has just come through from John Chettleborough, which would be kind of relevant for any of you as presenters, which was, did the use of the DCED standard for results measurement give you more confidence in the results that were presented?
Maybe I can take it. Can you hear me? Yes, I think you can. Yeah, thanks for the question, John. And I think someone else asked something very similar. Basically, yes, it did. The DCED standard is one of the criteria used by the Beam Exchange when kind of ranking different research pieces on their credibility, and especially if the program has been audited for the use of the standard, then you know they were using it and you have a kind of objective measure of the extent to which they were using it well. So yes, it does give you more confidence in the results. It gives a lot more depth to the reporting and a lot more kind of clarity about the logic of the program. So I think this strengthens the evidence base in that we have a lot more high quality, self-reported kind of internal evaluations, results measurement activities. I don't think it is enough to serve as a replacement for a research agenda into whether and how market systems development works. Because at the end of the day, results like the internal MRM function is not designed to be a kind of a research function. They serve different purposes. They look at slightly different things. That's it from my side.
Thank you. Yes. Let me move the conversation on. So we had a couple of actually sort of related questions early on, which really are quite meaty ones. So I'm going to try and put them into the mix now. I mean, one question was from Matthias Helvetas. He said, "Is there evidence that non-MSD projects that don't use a market systems approach work better, or why do we constantly feel the need to justify why a systems approach is better than a direct delivery approach?" Now, if you hold that question, which is perhaps a little bit rhetorical, in mind, Jason Agar also asked, he pointed out that we seek systemic change in dynamic environments with multiple players exerting influences in multiple directions. Are we trying to measure the unmeasurable? And if you think not, do we need to rethink our approaches, which look more like they rely on more static systems that exist in isolation or other actors and changes? So in other words, are we trying to measure the unmeasurable? And why are we comparing ourselves? And are we comparing ourselves with other systems, with other approaches, as it were, direct delivery?
So it's a good question, Kevin. Do you want to give your thoughts and then I'll contribute, or should I go first?
Got disconnected there for a short period of time. Apologies. So I just got the end of that question, Mike, and a phrase that we were discussing earlier, Adam and I, is we're almost falling over ourselves to gather evidence to prove, and the use of the word, that market systems is a approach to the best approach to development. And the other thing that came up is Projects that we see as direct delivery, they don't categorize themselves as direct delivery programs, unlike us as a community of market systems development. So I think that provides a narrative in some sense of we're a community that are looking to define ourselves as market system development practitioners. It gives us a certain perspective on other programs that they don't necessarily have and reflect on themselves. I do think that there is, within the evidence space, there are lots of examples of the programs achieving change, and I think it's about how that's communicated and brought into a narrative when discussing with funders, donors, and those who are looking to support market systems programs. And it's not an easy task to do, but it's something that has to continue. And I think it can be measured. If we go back to what we were discussing earlier, looking at some of the human stories and the outcome harvesting as well. So we should be looking at new ways to do.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and kind of underlying it is this the right question to be asked? And I think there are a couple of responses. One of them is, even if we don't think it's the right question to be asked, it is being asked of us. So I think there is kind of pressure from different areas to say, well, okay, prove, does the MSD approach work? Can you prove it? So to just say, well, it's not the right question, I think isn't enough. I think also there are costs to an MSD approach, both in obviously the programs cost money, but also to move from direct delivery to an MSD imposes a cost on a program. And if you want to impose that cost, you kind of need to justify it. So I think it is a valid question. I think it is also something where we could have more evidence than we do. You're never going to have a perfect evidence base, but I think there is scope for improvement. Mike, I think you also have your own perspective, so maybe you want to add.
Well, I think I agree with what you've just said, which is that it's a messy situation, and we are being asked a question about whether we're achieving results and proving that it works. And so I think we need to try and work on that. And I think my own experience over 4 years of watching this evidence base grow has been a continuing frustration that although programs seem to make a lot of effort, including through using the DCD standard, to generate more robust evidence, there simply isn't sufficient investment in the ex post evaluations, the independent evaluations that would capture the impact that comes out of more longer term systemic change. And since we are fundamentally about trying to achieve longer term, long lasting, enduring results, then that seems to be where we ought, ideally as a sector, to be investing to try and find the evidence. And I feel that has been simply been inadequate. And I mean, I don't want to sort of put the spotlight on any particular donors, but I have heard stories about donors who've had sort of intentions to do ex post evaluations of major programs, and then because of the internal kind of incentives within the organization, that those ex post evaluations have not happened, or have been put off, or kind of dropped off the agenda, and you wonder why it isn't. Well, it is frustrating that we don't put more into that. So if what we do at the Beam Exchange with this evidence review is really push this agenda of trying to get greater investment in independent ex post evaluations, or at least these longitudinal evaluations that Ed was mentioning, then that would be a good thing. That's where I'm coming from.
And say,
we lost Ed from the presenter list, but I might see if he has a view on this. Although perhaps as an independent evaluation organisation, ITAD obviously have their own interests. But Ed, I see you're back. And do you have a sense of where the trend is? Are we seeing more rigorous ex post and independent evaluations now coming up? Are they in the pipeline? Okay, Ed, still not.
Great.
Ed, how are you?
Sorry about that. It takes a while when I press the unmute button. I think so. We're seeing a lot more. We are seeing longitudinal evaluations coming up through the pipeline, but they focus on sort of the area of more of impact investing and sort of less around kind of market systems programs specifically. I also agree that if we had a greater number of longitudinal evaluations and evaluations which allowed us to look at questions around sustainability, that would certainly enhance the evidence base. We were able to do that a little bit with food trade and SAMOTH, but certainly, so SAMOTH is the evaluation I had more experience on. We still didn't really have the time the time hadn't elapsed for us to really make a judgment on some of the later interventions, which we felt were more market systems focused on whether they had actually produced sustainable results. So more time would have been ideal.
Okay. I mean, there's a comment or two from Al Habib in the chat box suggesting that the market systems development is modelled against private sector. I mean, I think it means it's considered as an alternative form of private sector development. So what is the performance evidence provided by other forms of private sector development? Is it time we begin to get over how special we think market systems development is? But I wonder, I mean, are you aware of other independent ex post evaluations of other forms of private sector development that do justice to a comparison?
I'm not aware. I don't know the evidence base in other sectors very well. I think this question of like, well, is MSD working harder than it has to be? Do other areas have evidence bases? Has kind of come up in different ways. But I think, yes, if MSD keeps claiming that we have a significant benefit over other forms of development, over direct delivery, then the question of, well, where is the evidence for this will continue to come, whether or not other forms of delivery have evidence based or not.
What do you think? I mean, to go back to your final point about the need, if you like, to get away from a focus on project or program evaluations and look more at a sector-wide evaluation of the approach, which would, I guess, would look at this kind of question of comparing us as a field with other sorts of how the field evaluates impact. I mean, do you see any mileage in this?
So I'm now getting a bit more speculative, and this is not like beyond what we said in the evidence review, but I think there are two ways you can go. One way is to look at an MSD project, but not just in isolation. Also look at either multiple MSD programs and see how they differ in their implementation and what difference this makes to the results, or compare an MSD with a non-MSD program and say, look, they're both going in different ways, but one is providing training directly, one is working through training institutes or whatever. How does this play out in practice? I think Anastasia in the comments kind of expressed skepticism about the possibility of comparison between different sectors. And obviously you kind of always need to take context into account. But I think part of the problem with an individual project evaluation is that you don't have this point of comparison. You don't have the context which is provided by a comparison approach. And the second possibility is to go through the market. So start with your unit of analysis as a market system. I haven't seen an evaluation which has done that, though I suspect that they are out there. I think that would be a really interesting way to better understand what influences market systems.
Yeah, well, actually, on the Beam Exchange, we have some resources that do look at that. And in particular, I'm thinking of the work that FSG did a couple of years ago, where they looked at 20 sectors, market systems around the world, and that have experienced significant pro-poor inclusive growth over 10 or longer years. And what they did was they tried to look at, this was a piece of work that was commissioned for the Rockefeller Foundation, and they looked at what kind of drove change in those sectors. And actually, in most cases, it was very little to do with donor-funded projects. But it still told some very interesting stories. That report is called Shaping Inclusive Markets, and is available on the Beam Exchange. So there's definitely scope to do that kind of I mean, it's possible to do that kind of work, and it might raise some interesting questions about the role that donor-funded programs can play in long-term growth of or long-term pro-poor inclusive growth. I don't want to have the last word because we have only got 2 or 3 minutes left. So Adam or Kevin, would you like to say anything as a sort of wrapping up?
I don't want this to be the last word, but I think it's a point worth making that several people expressed a lot of interest in what I said about outcome harvesting. So I think they kind of missed exactly what I said. But I think my kind of overall point was that we did outcome harvesting to better understand the skills development sector and how a program had influenced it. And although outcome harvesting is a good approach for collecting rigorous qualitative analysis, I don't think it gave more insight into a system as such than any other form of qualitative research, or for what we all do by going out into the marketplace and speaking with people who are affected by it. So I guess it was more of a caution against kind of methodological or methods as solutions towards trying to think about how research can span different projects.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
Kevin,
thanks Adam. Yeah, just a few points that might help us close off. I think the first one would be on the evidence base itself. I think we recognise that there's some caveats there and that there's also continued improvement going. But I personally would go back to this evidence map when I was looking to design interventions or look at experiences of what's worked in similar sectors. So I'd encourage anyone who's in that stage of the programming to give it a look and see what they can get from it. And I think secondly, this conversation doesn't end here. I'm sure anyone who has further questions or would like to follow up with Adam, myself, or Mike, feel free to look me up on LinkedIn or reach out through Beam. And thirdly is that I've seen a lot of programs implemented now over the last 10 or more years, both direct delivery and market systems development, and they're not all done well. But when you do market systems development well, you're looking at the principles which we all push forward. You do see great outcomes, and I think that continual discussion on how we measure that and how we explain that narrative to our funders continues with everyone in this room. So thanks everyone for participating.